Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another Fun Ideas podcast. And today I have yet another Beatles author because they're coming in droves right now, which is a great thing because I love the Beatles and I love to read everybody's new Beatle book because usually it covers a topic in a different way. And so today I have Gene Popa. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well.
Good.
And I always ask, since I'm in Oregon, where are you coming from?
I am in North Carolina.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, the inevitable question. Well, first I'll mention the book. You've written a book called British Invasion '64,
All
and
right.
there it is. And the inevitable question is, why did you write a book about the Beatles?
Well, I should say it's not simply about the Beatles, but of course, the British invasion only happened because of the
True.
Beatles. But
Hmm.
we actually cover a host of British artists that came over in that year. And essentially, when I decided to become a full time writer, my decision was I want to write the books that I want to read but aren't out there yet. And there really has not been a good book about the British invasion ever. There's been some books that cover it, but they're really not available right now these days. So I
Hmm.
thought it's about time somebody did one. Might as well be me.
Hmm. And I guess this would kind of reveal your age, but I have to ask: were you around when the British invasion of because was happening, or no?
I fell just short of that. I was born in 1966,
Okay,
so
so
that'd
you're
be
like me. Okay. Because I was saying, if you have firsthand experience or if it's all, retro, which is fine.
I've been such
Um,
a fan of the music of the 60s my entire life, so it really feels like I was a part of it. So,
mhm. And why this topic? Yeah, I mean, there's no right or wrong topic about the Beatles. There's been every topic done under the sun. But what intrigued you about this particular time in Beatles history and the British invasion with all the other groups?
well, honestly, I think like a lot of people, I just assumed that the British invasion was largely inevitable. It happened because it was meant to happen and nothing could stop it once it started. The more I dug into it, I discovered that wasn't the case. And it was really an instance of a lot of events falling into place, some of them by people who had no relation to one another. And it literally was blind luck that things came together as they did. And there were powerful efforts to put a stop to it. And we think in retrospect, hey, once the Beatles came, the Stones came, there was no stopping that. It very nearly was halted dead in its tracks.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I went through the book chapter by chapter, and I think you have one chapter where you're talking about Alan Sherman's "Pop Hates the Beatles," and I don't know if his personal opinion, Alan Sherman's personal opinion, was anti-Beatle, but certainly made for a fun record. But but I'm
Alex Sherman
sure a
moved
lot of
on.
people had that sentiment. That's what I was going to say.
Yes, yes. I don't think other than Hello Mother, Hello Father, I don't think a lot of kids were buying Alan Sherman records.
Right.
So he was playing towards the parents.
Hmm. And yeah, I never have figured out if he really was a Beatle fan or not, but he was probably too busy working on his own career to worry about that one way or the
I don't
other.
think he saw him as competition. He had his own thing going.
Yeah, yeah. Now in the book you have various chapters. They're all over the map on subjects, but I mean, to kind of generalize it, there's like a chapter kind of about the Dave Clark Five.
Mhm.
It's kind of a chapter sort of about the animals. And what made you choose the British acts you chose?
Primarily because they were the ones who had the greatest impact in that year,
Hmm.
not necessarily over the course of history. Some of these acts we don't really think about any longer, but at the time they were major. And in some instances, like the Dave Clark Five, a lot of people expected they were going to eclipse the Beatles.
Hmm.
Um, and there are other acts like I do write about the Rolling Stones, but they weren't huge hit makers in 1964. Their fame
Yeah,
came in 65 and after.
right.
So they were a second tier group initially.
Yeah. One thing I found that was handy in the book is at the end you had a little discography of what happened in '64.
Mhm.
And, Rolling Stones put out a decent amount of product, like two albums and about six singles. But other than Time Is on My Side, which they didn't even write, it's like I think everything else didn't really make a dent. I don't know, you know, how, I mean, it's like retro thinking like you. I don't know how successful they were in '64 itself. it took like 1965 when Satisfaction and the following hits that they wrote to kind of make them, so
The Stones are probably better well known in '64, more for the attitude they projected.
yeah.
Uh, as the journalist Tom Wolfe said, the Beatles want to hold your hands, but the Rolling Stones want to burn your town down. As the bad boys of the British invasion, they got a lot of press that way, but it wasn't necessarily so much for their music.
Hmm. Now, how do some of these other groups fit in that you talk about throughout the book?
Well, in some cases, they had the good luck to be managed by Brian Epstein, who was the manager of the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
So that instantly got American record companies interested in them. And there was a real rush in America once the Beatles hit big to grab whatever British artists were available and to put them out there. Many didn't go anywhere, but a lot of them had huge hits. Some of them only in the calendar year 1964. They'd have 4 or 5, 6 top 40 hits, and then you never heard from again from 65 onward.
Hmm.
But for that one brief year of their careers, they were kings of the mountain in America.
Right. And when you were choosing which groups to talk about, was chart success really what was the criteria? Just go by that.
Primarily chart success,
Okay.
the impact they had on the U.S. market.
Hmm.
I talk about Chad and Jeremy, who were British artists, but they had one minor hit. I think they hit number 37 in 1963. Never hit the British charts again after that. They came to America in 1964 and started having top 40 hits for the next few years. They were big stars in America, but were completely unknown back home in Britain.
Hmm. I actually didn't know that,
Yeah.
but that makes sense. It's like once the British invasion happened, anybody with an accent. I can't say Liverpudlian because some were from Manchester, some were from other territories of the colonies over there, or not the colonies, the United Kingdom over there. So, we're the colonies.
It seemed like every band with uh, an accent out of Dickens and Ishkabibble hair got a record deal in America.
And you said chart success is the reason you chose certain groups to talk about. Were there any you just had to leave out for whatever reason?
Not necessarily. I pretty much hit everyone who I felt deserved it. I'd have
Mhm.
liked to have written more about the Hollies, but the Hollies couldn't make a dent in America in 1964, which still baffles me. They did some great music in that year.
Yeah,
It wasn't until the end of '65 they started making the charts in America. And of course, they became bigger in '67 and '68. But
right.
they should have been a big act in '64. And for some reason, they weren't.
Yeah. That is kind of strange too. Yeah, and they even had hits into the 70s and stuff. So
Yeah.
it's like, but then, another one that I saw, and you only had one lowly hit, and I'm surprised it even made it in there, but it was recorded at the end of the year, 64, is The Who's I Can't Explain, which
Yes.
actually barely charted from what I remember, even though it's like a concert staple and
Mhm.
classic for them now. But um,
The Who have
what,
never been big top 40 stars in America. They've only
yeah.
hit the top 10 once.
Hmm.
Um, they've been huge in Britain from their very first song onwards. But
Hmm.
what makes them famous in America, of course, is the most raucous, loudest live act ever in rock and roll, and some really amazing conceptual albums they put out. And I think that's where their legend kind of rests. But as far as top 40 artists, they never really clicked very well in America.
Hmm. And using groups like that, is like, I haven't read completely through the book. So do you take the attitude throughout the book of, kind of like just staying in 1964 and this is what's happening now? You don't like project and say, well, they'll do better later, or do you kind of delve into that a little bit?
In some instances, when I wrap up a piece about an artist, I will occasionally say, and of course, they had greater fame in the next couple of years, or their success continued for a few years more. But by and large, I try and keep things in that time frame.
Hmm.
And I should mention that 1964, as far as my book is concerned, isn't a 12-month period. It starts in January of '64 and kind of runs until May or June of '65, because the first half year of 1965, all the music that came out was either recorded in '64 or released at the end of '64 and took a while to pick up steam. So essentially, '64 had a little 6-month gap at the end, a little coda.
Yeah, yeah. And I kind of noticed that because I was wondering how far is he going to go on this, and so like on using the Beatles as an example, you
Yeah.
include uh Beatles 65, which has 65 in the title, but
Oh, that
was
came out in
obviously
64.
recorded in 64. I mean, the British version was Beatles for Sale, so yeah.
Yes.
Just
Capitol did an astounding job of butchering Beatles albums and stretching, what were what 7 or 8 official releases in Britain into like 13 or 14 in America. I
right.
mean, they milked that cow, and they are still making millions off of it every year.
Hmm. Now, I'm partial to the British releases, but there are a couple of exceptions. I don't know how to rectify that in my mind, but I still think Meet the Beatles is a fantastic debut album.
Yeah,
Even though With the Beatles isn't bad, but you don't have any hit singles on it, and
Beatles says "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which is hard to pass up. That's an amazing song.
right. So, I understand some of those compilations, but yeah, by the time I got to Beatles 65, and you don't cover it, but like Beatles 6 and Yesterday and Today and those later ones, it's like, what's the point? You're pulling tracks off Revolver and making this Revolver album a bad album, and putting the tracks on this other album just has leftover tracks from the past on it. It's just really weird what they started doing eventually.
What was kind of a revelation to me when Capitol started releasing the Beatles British albums on CD in the 1980s
Hmm.
was I, like virtually every other American, was conditioned to remember those songs a particular way, not simply where they fall on the American album. In your mind, you're like, okay, this song's playing, the next one is going to be this one.
Right.
But they're very sound. I hadn't realized that when Capitol put out the American versions, they put a wash of echo over everything.
Yes.
So all those Beatles songs, as I remember them, are not how the Beatles recorded them. So it took a
Hmm.
while to retrain my brain to say, oh no, this is how it's supposed to sound.
You have to thank Dave Dexter for that.
Yes, we do. We do.
um, and it's kind of funny. One, I don't know if you've done this. It seems like everybody's done a compilation of their own at some point or another. Now with you know infinite, you know, iTunes and all different things, you can just have any track in any order or whatever. But when you in the days of burning a CD, I used to say I want to make a CD of my favorite Beatles tracks,
Yeah.
and I think I narrowed it down to 20, which is hard to do, but in a couple of cases I did exactly that. I used like the heavily echoed version of She's a Woman because I always preferred that one compared to the one that is the British release because I just thought the echo really worked in that case. But
And I think it did because that was definitely a song that was a throwback to the 50s for the Beatles. They were trying to evoke that era. So the echo works great on that. Yeah.
so, do you have a similar situation like that where you're used to a US version and then when the CDs came out, you said, huh, this one's not good. I like that other one.
Well, like I said, over time, I've retrained my mind
Oh,
to
yeah.
accept they are now. But, there's something about those American releases that, as much as they're bastard children, I mean, they're part of the tapestry of everything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's you gotta love them.
Hmm.
And I pull them out and I play them all the time on old vinyl. I still got my records from back in the day.
Hmm.
So it's they'll always be a part of me, and I think a part of everyone's memories.
Right, at least in the US. I always wonder about what people in Europe thought, and it's like they chopped up these albums terribly. The sound stinks.
The only instance where I think in Britain they thought the Americans got it right was, in Britain, the Magical Mystery Tour release was actually a double EP with only
Oh,
six
yeah.
songs. Whereas in America, they tacked on another half dozen songs, made it a full album. And after a couple of years in Britain, they said that's a good idea. So they swapped out and they started releasing the American version in the UK.
Yeah. It's kind of surprising in that case that they didn't do it that way, considering the British Help and the British Hard Day's Night was exactly that. One side of movie songs, one side of just filler tracks, I guess, for lack of a better term. But, you
Well,
know.
A Hard Day's Night, the American version, was a result of a lawsuit between Capitol Records and United Artists.
Hmm.
United Artists, of course, produced the film A Hard Day's Night.
Hmm.
They signed the Beatles to make a movie, expecting that it was going to flop. that nobody would want to see a Beatles movie.
Yeah.
They gave it an incredibly small budget, so small that the director Richard Lester had to shoot it in black and white. Couldn't afford to build any sets. Had to actually go out and use actual locations, which helped make it a fantastic film.
Hmm.
And United Artists did all this because they thought even if the film's a flop, the soundtrack is going to sell 1 million copies, and we're going to make money off of it.
Right.
Well, Capitol realized this as well, and they said, "Wait a minute, we have the exclusive rights to the Beatles in America. I don't care what contract you signed with Brian Epstein or Epstein. Pardon me, I want to get that right. Um, we have the rights, and we're going to sue you and prevent you from releasing this album in the United States." So the lawyers met, and they came to an agreement that the 7 songs that appear in the movie, United Artists would get, and Capitol got the other 6, which they very quickly sprinkled into some of their other US only albums.
Hmm.
To fill out the rest of the album, United Artists then went to George Martin, their producer, and said, "Can you do some instrumental versions of some of their songs and we'll pad out the album with that?"
Hmm.
And Martin did, and I'm sure it was a massive payday for him because that album was #1 in the US for 14 weeks.
Yeah.
And Martin went on to get nominated for an Oscar
Hmm.
for the soundtrack of the movie. So all in
Hmm.
all, I'd say he was very happy that Capitol made them take those songs off so he can get that opportunity.
Yeah. Interesting thing is, Capitol ended up with Something New and a couple singles, ended up putting out all the tracks anyway.
Yes,
You know, it
and
just wasn't all on the same album, which,
they rushed out
mm,
Something New, which had their Hard Day's Night soundtrack songs on it, simultaneous with the Hard Day's Night soundtrack. They wanted to knock the soundtrack off the #1 spot.
yeah.
They couldn't do it. So Hard Day's Night was #1 for 14 weeks, and for 9 weeks, 11 weeks, Something New was at the #2 spot.
Mhm.
So they were hanging in there, but they couldn't quite get the job done.
Now, I'll tell you my story first, and then I'll have you tell yours. Okay, so I knew of the Beatles when I was a little kid, but I always say that I became a Beatles fan around 1977 and started collecting things there. Um, Using Hard Day's Night as an example, I said, "Oh, I want the movie soundtrack." I don't know all these songs on Something New, and I always thought Something New was kind of a cheat. It has the same song, so I didn't even buy that album for a long time. I might not have even bought it until after the CDs came out. Because it's just like, eh, it's just the same album and a bunch of filler. Even though the other one had like musical interludes and stuff like that. But I was more focused anyway on Sergeant Pepper Forward, trying to get the later albums, typical of the time. You want the most modern sounding stuff. And then I kind of went back and got the earlier stuff. So that's my kind of basic story of how I got started with the Beatles. How did you kind of align yourself?
Um, Pretty much the same period of time. 77 was a bit of a Beatles boom, and that was because their contract with Capitol and EMI finally expired.
Hmm.
So the labels were free to put all these, the Beatles love songs and the Beatles rock and roll music, all these compilation albums that the Beatles had previously prevented them from releasing. And part and parcel with that was you saw a lot of Beatles books on the stands, a lot of Beatles magazines. There was a bit of the Clash referred to phony Beatlemania in the song London Calling. That's what
Hmm.
it was referred to as, that they were trying to create new Beatlemania. But
Hmm.
it caught my attention. And then I actually really discovered the Beatles and got into them through a non-musical means.
Hmm.
Marvel Comics put out the Beatles story,
Yeah.
which is written by David Anthony Kraft and drawn by George Perez.
Mhm.
And I read that and I said, these are the most amazing people in the world. I have to find out everything about them.
Hmm.
And I went to the local record store in town, Stardust Records, long gone sadly.
Hmm.
And I started buying with Meet the Beatles, Beatles' second album, Something New, Hard Day's Night. I started working my way through, and I bought a couple of books about the Beatles, about the Hunter Davis book. I got some at the library, and the more I read and the more I listened, the more I realized that this is something truly profound.
Hmm.
I don't want to elevate them to godhood because they're definitely
Yeah.
ordinary, flawed human beings, but there was something cosmic that touched down on them at some point.
Hmm.
They were in the right place at the right time, and what they did in just a few short years. I mean, to this day, we're still talking about.
Right. I'm always fascinated, finding out how people got into it because especially when it's after they've broken up. Because in my case, my earliest memory of anything Beatles really wasn't Beatles. Um, was I think the very first song I heard probably was Yellow Submarine, but not by the Beatles. It was the Muppets on Sesame Street.
Yes,
And
yes.
so it was years later I go, oh, that's that same song that the Muppets did, it's like, but and my way of getting into the Beatles was similar, where it was not something musical, it was something outside of it. I had already become a Monty Python fan, and I was already a Saturday Night Live fan. My dad always was into comedy and stuff like that, not so much into music. So any new comedy that was good, I was exposed to at a very young age. So the story, and I've said this on this podcast before, so forgive me if I say it again, is Saturday Night Live episode with Eric Idle as the host, and he comes out and he sings a song very badly of "Here Comes the Sun," and so he strums the car, boom, "Here comes the sun," and he starts yelling it out, and then the ongoing joke is, "This is so good, Eric. We should save it for the end of the show," and basically kind of get off the stage. Um, and so I asked my parents, what is the real song sound like? I didn't even know, the way he was singing it. And my parents actually had Abbey Road. And so I started at the end of their career. And they said, oh, yeah, we have the album there. It's that one where the people are walking across the street called Abbey Road there. And I go, oh, okay. So I pull out the album, put on side two, play Here Comes the Sun. I go, oh, I know this song. It just didn't sound like anything when Eric Idle was doing it.
No.
So I said, what else is on this? So I flipped it over, started over side one. First songs come together. Oh, I know this song. Next song, something. Oh, I know this song. I don't know if I know Maxwell Silverhammer or whatever, but I did know Octopus's Garden and a couple others. And I go, and then the epiphany everybody always has when it comes to good albums by artists is, that's not right. There can't be this many hits on an album. An album is like one or two great songs and the rest filler. And it didn't make sense to me. There was a lot of good songs on this all at once. And so that kind of made me a Beatles fan. And then I asked my parents, do we have any other Beatle records? And oh, we got the single for Help. And I go, oh, okay. And so I played Help, and I go, oh, I know that song too. I flipped it over, I'm Down. Well, I didn't know that one, but I thought it was a cool song. And so I was kind of hooked. And so I wanted to get anything and everything, but I wasn't sure on song titles or anything.
Yeah.
So I started collecting the later ones because the later albums were all in color. And I remember getting Magical Mystery Tour, we just mentioned next, because it had a booklet. I figured if the songs suck, at least it has lots of nice pictures in it. But turns out I loved it. And then I got Sergeant Pepper shortly after that for similar reasons, like a nice, colorful album. I avoided the white album for quite a long time because it's just white and it was a double album and very expensive.
Yes.
And I started getting the earlier ones, but I kind of jumped around. The songs looked like too many cover versions. I kind of avoided those,
Yeah.
things like that.
The nice thing is there are no bad Beatles albums.
No, but
What's made the needle up and passed over, like, I don't need to hear Revolution number 9 again. Good.
yeah,
But yeah, there's something to recommend on every single one of their albums, and particularly in the early years, that they put out so much music in such a short span of time. We're in an era now where, well, look at Adele. Her album's, 19, 21, and now she's up to 30. It's not an album every year.
no.
It's
Eh,
4 or 5 years between albums.
And using her as an example, I always say I'm waiting for her next album called 70. So, and people who know her career get the joke, and it's like, anyway, but yeah, it is amazing when you look back on it because, even now, granted, he's in his 80s and, but, it's even Paul doesn't put out an album in a year. And Ringo, when he does put out albums, he's kind of done these EP things. So it kind of
Yeah.
gives a semblance of doing one or two a year, but he's just doing shorter versions. It's amazing that they're putting out any new material at all at this age, but it's it just I noticed that nobody's like motivated to put out more than one album a year, if that,
I
So,
think Paul could if he wanted to. I
oh, I'm
think he
sure he could.
wants to. I'm going to give him all the credit in the world. I saw him a couple of years ago live, and he played for 2 hours, nonstop, no breaks. Voice was strong throughout, barely broke a sweat. Meanwhile, I was panting for breath walking back to my car in the parking lot. I had exhausted myself doing that. So for a man at his age, to be able to do that is
Yeah.
astonishing. So happy he's still sharing his talent.
Well, I don't have a recent Paul thing, but I know he's done those marathon concerts. I think the last time I saw him was in 2005. But Ringo I saw in June, just a couple months ago. And the funny thing is similar as far as everybody's stamina. At the end of the concert, Ringo's on stage still doing jumping jacks at age 82. Meanwhile, at the end of the concert, everyone around me is struggling to get up off the grass because I was at a seat on the grass. And I'm like,
Yeah.
some people really needed help, and it's like, wow, I guess you never sit down on the ground anymore. Anyway,
These days when I go to a show, I'm no longer interested in standing on my feet with 30,000 of my best friends. Like,
yeah,
are there good seats there? Are they comfortable? Can we
yeah,
sit and go from them the whole time? That's what I really want at this age.
yeah, yeah. So, do you collect everything Beatles or just group stuff, or did you go into the solo years and everything like that?
I've got a lot of Beatles material. I've always been a huge fan. I've got much of their solo work.
Hmm.
Um, Still some things every now and then I'm like, I should pick that up. But
Hmm.
thanks to the internet, I can also listen to albums.
Sure.
I go to YouTube and hear it. And after having heard Dark Horse on YouTube, I don't know if I need to own Dark Horse. Um, in and of itself, not a terrible album, but just his voice is so shot that it undermines all the music.
Hmm.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, I appreciate them. I have books that all over the place. I don't have enough shelf space for all
Yeah.
the books. So,
Actually, I'll say something about Dark Horse since you mentioned that. So it's always been like one of my least favorite Harrison albums. I think I'd rather listen to electronic sound, but because his voice is so bad on most of the tracks. The version I actually prefer, because I'm dumb enough to rebuy it every time they reissue it, is the latest one where they did a nice remaster of it. And I think that they worked on his vocal a little bit to kind of lose some of the rest.
yeah.
But I'm thinking now, because my dream was before George passed, is that he would like think twice about it and say, I should go back and re-record the vocals on this album
Yes.
now that I have my voice again. But he never did. But I'm not the hugest fan of AI, but I understand its possibilities. And I said,
Yes.
they could do an AI version of Dark Horse.
Mhm.
I'm
Although,
surprised nobody's done it yet, but anyway.
shortly before his passing, he cut the new version of My Sweet Lord for
Yeah,
its 30th anniversary. And his voice at that point had really gone down. And it's almost sad to listen to it.
yeah.
I wish he'd have done it a few years earlier before his health took such a downturn. And again, much like you, I remember thinking back in the 90s, he's not recording anything new right now. What a perfect opportunity to redo Dark Horse so people can really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, and then, I have listened to this. I mean, even though I have certain opinions about AI, I'm curious. I'm just, and so there's been some people that they've taken McCartney's tracks from Egypt Station and McCartney 3 and new,
Mhm.
and they've kind of made his voice younger and less aged. And I hate to say it, I really like what these people did. He sounds like he's like 30 again, and it's like, oh my God, it's like we're not
Well,
supposed to like this.
there's some question right now because apparently Penn Jillette has heard the work in progress on Now and Then, the new
Yeah.
song Paul Ringo are doing.
Hmm.
He says they used AI to de-age Paul's voice, but others are saying no, they're using the vocal track Paul laid down back in the 90s during the anthology sessions, and his voice was younger and stronger then.
Hmm.
Either way, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
If you've ever heard John's demo of Now and Then,
Hmm.
it's a really strong song, and it's
Yeah.
a shame that he didn't record it himself for his solo work. And it's a shame that the Beatles didn't complete their recording in the 90s on it, because
Yeah.
I think it was a better song than Real Love.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to finally hear it.
Yeah. I for what I've heard is that George wasn't a big fan of it for whatever reason. I kind of have my suspicions that George had had enough Beatle reunion stuff, and that tackling a third one was just too much. He figured, oh, I've already done two. That
Yeah.
could be an A side and a B side. I'm done. It's like, and probably didn't even think about, oh yeah, one goes on anthology 1, 2, and 3, and blah blah
Well,
blah.
what's fascinating
Yeah,
is that when John recorded his demo on a cassette, he wrote on the cassette for Paul.
yeah,
And according to Yoko, he intended to offer to Paul, say, would you like to finish this song up? Because he had spoken off and on for years about writing with Paul again.
yeah.
And in the late 70s, he even gave a deposition.
Hmm.
Uh, the four Beatles sued the Beatlemania stage production.
Yeah,
And the grounds were, according to John, that we have plans to reunite, and this is muddying the marketplace. People are going to be confused whether we're Beatlemania or the Beatles.
right.
Whether he was just saying that for the lawyers or not, the fact that he would even say that means it had to be something he'd thought about.
Yeah. I think, my opinion, I mean, it's opinion, obviously, we never will know, but I mean, my opinion is they probably did plan eventually to do something. I can't see him going uh their rest of their lives never ever being curious themselves, even, just privately, just, I wonder what we'd sound like if we all four got together and tried something new. I mean,
I don't think they've been the Beatles. I think they've
yeah,
been like, that's too much baggage.
yeah,
Well, let's be Johnny and the Moondogs again.
yeah,
Just have fun.
yeah.
No expectations.
I kind of think this is, and I said this on one of the other recent Beatles shows, is that I kind of think that they would have eventually gotten around to doing the anthology. Whether they would have done it at that same time, who knows? But let's say they did, and of course John would have been a part of it. And I think I don't think that they would have churned out appreciable more music, but I think that the highlight always would have been is like they would have had a filmed appearance of them doing one last go round. I don't know if you're familiar with like Paul Simon's One Trick Pony, which has I think the final appearance of the Lovin'
Yes,
Spoonful. It
I
kind of
was watching that video last
yeah,
night.
yeah. Yeah, so similar to something like that.
Yeah,
And the other thing I was gonna say about the only thing I can equate it to, people always say, oh, if the Beatles stayed alive, they would have been like the Rolling Stones. I don't know. I don't think so. I kind of equate it more like ABBA, where they just kind of ended. They never really said they broke up. I mean, I guess the Beatles did eventually say they broke up, but so did ABBA eventually. And
yeah.
then they went through years of saying, we'll never ever get back together. And then they finally did. So, it's like, you know, I figure that's probably more likely what
Yeah.
the Beatles scenario would have kind of been like, and but who
I
knows,
like to think if John had lived and he'd taken part in the anthology project, I think he'd have been the one to say, let's go on a rooftop somewhere and do a couple songs.
Yeah.
Unannounced, get the cameras rolling, and let's bookend.
Or maybe do one of those wacky locations they said, like the Sahara Desert, or go
Yeah,
go to the moon or something. No.
give me a Mount Everest.
Beatles on the moon. Yeah. Anyway, so of course, it's all speculation and everything. What is your opinion on AI in regards to any use of it on a Beatles track with Paul or Ringo's involvement?
Well, I'm going to reserve final judgment until I hear the song, but I agree that AI is a useful tool.
Hmm.
Um, I do not think it should be relied upon the way some artists use it now to create art when it's just a computerized drawing. There's no creativity put into it.
Right.
And we're going to start getting music where we're going to be hearing a lot of deceased artists playing new songs these days. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
Um, I hope the Beatles, Paul and Ringo, are going to kind of set a standard saying, use it sparingly, use it
Yeah.
to clean up bad tape hiss, to bolster voices, to help, which they're doing digitally for years anyway.
Yeah.
But don't rely on it to create an entirely new song, and
Right.
don't generate John and George's voices start to finish, uh, because then that's playing with a synthesizer. That's not
Yeah.
organic music.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I on this now and then using that again as an example. I have no problem if they use it, you know, to a certain level,
Mhm.
and because at least one Beatles is actually involved. Like if Capital or EMI or whatever label we're considering, Apple or whatever, just decides, oh, we're going to put out a new Beatle record from scratch. We're not going to involve Paul and Ringo, their old news, and we'll just create something out of nothing. Thumbs down on that. But
Well, Paul and Ringo were involved with the Love soundtrack,
yeah,
and that used early generation AI to help reorganize the music. And I thought it did a very impressive job.
yeah,
Won't replace the original songs, but in
right.
terms of how it was employed with the stage show, fantastic.
Right.
Good.
And for people who quibble, well, the Beatles always embraced new technologies,
Mhm.
whether they used it forever on every one of their records. I mean, I'm sure even McCartney dabbled with the auto tune when it first came out, but he didn't go so blatant like Cher did with Believe or something like, whoa, whatever. But
He'd save that for like his work with the Fireman and his
yeah, yeah.
experiments.
So I mean, I have no problem with them experimenting with new technologies just to see what it does. But to rely on it 100%, I think that's kind of wrong. And
It's funny, people talk about how, when they did Sergeant Pepper, they did it on two 4-track recorders they wired together, which was amazing. They had to do things like that because EMI wouldn't tell them, oh, we've got this 16-track recorder, because they knew the Beatles would take it and use it for 6 months and no one else could use it.
right,
The Beatles thought EMI was just too cheap to buy new equipment. EMI was not just telling them, oh, we have this now.
yeah.
Well,
Well, even Abbey Road didn't have 16 tracks. Was it eight at the end? Or,
I believe it was
yeah.
8, although I think they did, like they did Sergeant Pepper, they wired two 8-tracks together
Oh,
for,
okay, okay. I wasn't sure,
but it
but
was also their first use of the Moog synthesizer.
right, right. So, and like you, I like the Love compilation, and but I am glad that they keep the original versions available. And of course, we did talk earlier about what is the original version, the British one or the US one. Well, all of them have kind of been available, and they've reissued the American versions on CD, even the heavily echoed versions over the years. So,
Yes.
or you can go back to the original vinyl or whatever,
Or
So,
new vinyl. Vinyl
yeah,
is huge, and they keep putting
yeah,
out new versions.
yeah. So it's all there, which, that's what I'm happiest about. It would kind of suck if they said, well, here's the Beatles' Love, and we're going to delete this whole catalog. It's like, what?
Yeah, it's amazing that in the long run, the Beatles didn't produce as much music as you might think an artist of their stature did. A little over 100 songs.
Yeah,
You look at somebody like Louis Armstrong. I mean, there are whole years of his career where you can't get that music these days. It just nobody has put it out right now. So there are
right, right.
gaps in his long history of music, which is horrifying because he created amazing music right from the start all the way to the end.
Yeah,
We're not going to have to worry about that with the Beatles. That
no,
stuff is always going to be there. And it's nice to think about that immortality, that long after we're gone, the stuff we like now, that we liked 50 years ago, is still going to be loved.
Mhm. Going back to your book a little bit, probably should talk about it a little bit. Um, did you interview anybody to get information, or what was your approach to each chapter and how you wrote the book?
Unfortunately, there aren't that many people available these days who
Mhm,
were a part of all of that. I had spoke with some people in the past. I picked up little nuggets of information here and there.
mhm,
Um, I contacted a couple of artists who were hit makers in '64, and they were like, "Yeah, I'll talk with you, but I can't do it right now." And then as deadlines were passing, I'm like, "I really can't wait any longer. I'm sorry." Uh, I don't think it detracts from the book at all because the information I did find out about virtually everyone I wrote about, in some instances, the things that I've never seen collected all together in other books.
mhm.
And I've come across a couple of other facts that I've never read anywhere. I got them from contemporary news sources, and they were news at the time and then promptly forgotten. And the history books since then overlooked it all. So I was very pleased to come across things like that.
Hmm. Okay.
But mostly, I spent my time scouring newspapers, magazines, old interviews with others.
Mhm. I guess, can you reveal one of the nuggets that you found quite interesting that hasn't really been discussed
Yeah,
elsewhere much?
I joke that my book is about 1964's heroes and villains, and the villain turned out to be a hero. I'll talk about the villain who turned out to be a hero. Herman Kennan was the president of the American Musicians Federation,
Mhm.
American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union.
Mhm.
Um, he took the job in the late 50s and inherited what he saw as an interminable problem. Britain did not allow most American musicians to play in the UK. They said to do so would be to take working jobs away from British musicians.
Yeah.
And as a result, with very few exceptions, mostly classical musicians or somebody of the stature of Louis Armstrong could come and play. When the jazz pianist Stan Kenton applied for a tour in Britain, he was turned down by the British Musicians Union. So he turned to his union and said, "Can you straighten this out with them?"
Mhm.
And that turned out to be a years long negotiation where basically the British Musicians Union didn't budge.
Mhm.
They really didn't give up any ground. And by 64, Herman Kennan was really tired of this. He wanted to change this. And when the British invasion happened, he saw his opportunity.
Mhm.
And it was a brilliant plan. And he made himself a villain to accomplish it.
Mhm.
He gave a interview with a syndicated columnist where he said, "The Beatles are not immortal to us." He said, "You could find," I love this quote, "you could find four kids in Yonkers or Tennessee who do the exact same thing they do." He said, "If they intend to come back to this country, they'll have to leave their instruments behind and just hire American musicians to play behind them. And they'll have to be a vocal group."
Wow.
And he said that same goes for all the other British groups. And this set off alarm bells in teenage America. Uh, they were like, "What do you mean the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five and Herman's Hermits can't come to America? I want to see them."
Yeah.
Now, teenagers in 1964 couldn't vote. You had to be 21.
Mhm.
But they could write letters to editors. They could write letters to the American Federation of Musicians. They could write letters to their congressmen.
Yeah.
64 was an election year. Everybody in the House of Representatives was up for re-election. And a lot of congressmen started getting these angry letters from teenagers in their districts. And they were like, "What is this about?" And at first they were inclined to dismiss it. And then they're like, "Wait a minute, what if my opponent can use this against me somehow?"
Mhm.
So a number of Democratic representatives passed the letters along to the White House and told President Lyndon Johnson, "You settle this." So President Johnson turned to his Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, and said, "You settle this."
Yeah.
The U.S. Labor Department then opened negotiations between the British Musicians Union and the American Federation of Musicians and essentially said, "Okay, this ban on American musicians going to Britain and this reciprocal ban now the EFM is threatening
Mhm.
comes to a halt now."
Mm.
Initially, the British Musicians Union said, "No, we're sticking to our guns."
Mm.
But things had changed this time. They were coming under a lot of pressure from sources that hadn't cared about this previously.
Yeah.
Um, the head of EMI was Sir Joseph Lockwood, who had a lot of connections to the British government. One of the investors in the Beatles merchandising company was a member of royalty, so he had ties to the royal family. And
Mhm.
of course, Britain was exporting millions of records around the world thanks to the Beatles and others. And this was threatening to hamper that. And Britain was in a recession at the time. Just about the only bright spot in their economy were record sales.
Mm.
So the union came under huge pressure from various sources and they capitulated completely. They said, "Fine. Any American wants to come play here, they're welcome. Any Brit who wants to go to the US, bon voyage."
Mm.
And as a result, British acts could then tour in the United States without worrying about being kicked out.
Mhm.
And that was Herman Kennan's plan all along. He played the bad guy in this, knowing that he could get the ball rolling and get things changed for the better. He
Mhm.
was willing to play the bad guy, and I applaud him for that. It was a brilliant strategy.
Mhm. And yeah, you're right. I have never heard that before. Now, that makes me wonder, like, you see photos of like Little Richard with the Beatles in England when they're touring around, and a few other American acts. Was that before this happened or after, or how'd that
Yes,
work?
there wasn't a total ban, and if you were a name artist,
Oh, okay.
you could usually get in, but there were certain restrictions on how many shows you could do.
Yeah,
Um, you, except in a few instances, had to have British musicians backing you.
yeah. I think Roy Orbison was another one that made it over
Yes,
to, yeah.
yes. So
Um,
there were some minor exceptions, but
mhm.
in many instances, artists were simply told, "No, stay back in America. You're not welcome
Oh,
here."
okay. I mean, I know the story with Elvis that Colonel Tom Parker couldn't travel, you know,
Yes,
so that would have been a non-starter. But I'm wondering, had he been able to, if they would have allowed Elvis in, or if they would have put severe restrictions on him.
I think they would have, because Elvis would
Mm,
have been such a huge moneymaker that
mhm.
everyone would realize it'd be in everyone's best interest to let him come play in Britain.
Okay, they would. Okay, all right, but
A jazz band like Stan Kenton was going to be playing small theaters. He was going to generate a lot of cash. So the union was like, no, you can't come.
okay. So prior to this agreement, they basically picked and choose picked and chose their battles, as it were.
And there was really no
Yeah.
rhyme or reason.
Right. Okay. Um, do you think that plays along to, McCartney loves to say the story, which is questionable sometimes, it wouldn't matter what source, depending on what source you read, is he always says, well, we didn't want to go to America unless we had a number one, but apparently the Ed Sullivan deal was already in the planning even before they had a number one. So kind of hard to say what is exactly correct on that. But going with Paul's thing, do you think that that ban is why artists like Cliff Richards had no chance in America because they were kind of banning British acts pre-Beatles?
I think it wouldn't have mattered so much on the American side if Cliff Richard had come over. I don't understand why Cliff Richard wasn't having hits in
Yeah.
America. He was having number one hits in Britain from 1959, and he's still a top 40 presence in the UK to this
Hmm.
day.
Hmm.
He put out some really good music, and other than a couple of minor top 40 hits,
Yeah.
um, he couldn't get arrested in the US until the late 70s when he had a couple of songs in the top 10.
Right.
But and I don't understand why he didn't connect with American audiences.
Hmm.
Maybe if he had toured, he could have built up interest. But I think his feeling was, I'm really busy everywhere else in the world. I mean, I
Yeah.
have every country, and
Yeah.
I sell out stadiums. Why do I want to go to America and beg for an audience?
Right. I'm wondering if Elvis had anything to do with that, even indirectly, because Elvis is around till the late '70s, and then once he's gone, oh, we can bring in Cliff Richards and have some hits now. I don't know. It's probably coincidence, but
I would say that there are probably a lot of people who like Elvis who also like Cliff Richard's music. I think
yeah.
they're
Mhm.
compatible with each other. I think a lot of people who like Ricky Nelson would have liked Cliff if they'd have gotten exposure to him,
Yeah.
but they didn't, so they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing else I saw in your book, flipping through it, is you do cover various news articles which were kind of important during that calendar year and even before, like JFK's assassination, things like that. How do you feel that all this played together in making the British invasion happen?
You can't overstate the impact of the assassination on the American psyche. Um, I think in retrospect, people think, well, everybody was just in deep despair. No, actually, people tried to get back to normal. The biggest hit movies in the weeks after the assassination were comedies, Under the Yum Yum Tree and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. So
Yeah.
to laugh.
Hmm.
The second biggest song of the Christmas holiday season was Louie Louie.
Hmm.
So, but there was nevertheless this gray pall that kind of settled over everything.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people were kind of mentally holding their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. What's going to happen next?
Hmm.
You're prepared for something terrible to happen. But
Hmm.
instead, here is this burst of joy coming out of their car radios that just
Hmm.
excites them. It gets the pulse pumping. And
Yeah.
I think people just exhaled collectively and just said, okay, this is a good thing.
Yeah.
And it was one of those instances of circumstances falling like dominoes and things you couldn't predict happening, all coming together at the exact right moment. Um,
Hmm.
you know, you mentioned about Paul talked about, well, we didn't want to come unless we had a number one hit song. They hoped they had a number one hit song, but the fact
Right.
is, when they signed the contract to appear on Ed Sullivan, they couldn't even get a major label in America to release their stuff. I
Right.
mean, they were on VJ for a couple of releases, and that really went nowhere. Then they got put on the Tiny Swan label, which put on
Hmm.
"She Loves You," which should have been a number one song to anyone who heard it.
Yeah.
It flopped. They got signed to do the Ed Sullivan Show, and that actually helped them convince Capitol to sign them. Said, "Look, we're doing 3 weeks on the Sullivan Show. People are going to want to listen to our music. You need
Yeah.
to put out an album."
Yeah.
Capitol, and again, for whatever reason, Dave Dexter and Alan Livingston, the president, had previously turned down the Beatles.
Yeah.
They were jazz guys. They didn't know rock. But they a year earlier had said, no, we don't want them on the label.
Hmm.
And now they give it another list. They say, you know what, we can make this work. And they budgeted an unheard of $50,000 for a marketing campaign
Hmm.
to really push the Beatles, and it was really innovative. I mean, everything from in-store displays, which were fairly common, uh, to stickers that got plastered on every flat surface in America over the Christmas season. Except it was a drawing of a Beatle haircut, a pixie haircut, and simply said the Beatles are coming. And I have to wonder how many people thought, who are these Beatle girls?
Right. Right. Yeah.
But the most innovative investment they made was it was Capitol who were behind the manufacture of Beatle Weeks.
Hmm.
And so they flooded stores with those. And now you had all these boys who had flat tops and suddenly they see the Beatles shaking their hair and they're like, I want hair like that.
Right.
It take me 4 months to grow it, but in the meantime, I'll put this wig on.
Yeah.
And just the circumstances that all fell together. Um, Capitol had not planned to release "I Want to Hold Your Hand" until the middle of January. That's what all their marketing was geared for.
Hmm.
DJ in Washington D.C. had a request from a listener. They'd seen a news report about the Beatles. Said, "I'm interested in the music. Can you play something?" He knew a stewardess for British Airways. He said, "Next time you do a round trip, will you bring me something?" She came back the next week and said, "Here's their new single." He started playing it, started getting a huge response from listeners.
Hmm.
Rival radio stations taped it off his radio broadcast and started playing it. Um, Capitol was panicking because this was not in their plan.
Right.
This early December and not middle of January, and they actually called the radio station and said cease and desist.
Mm.
They
Wow.
said, "You're out of your minds.
Yeah.
Want to hear this song? We're going to play it."
Yeah.
So Capitol then said, "All right, you can't beat them, join them."
Yeah.
They called the pressing plants. They said, "Stop everything else you're printing up for us. We need I Want to Hold Your Hand. We need hundreds of thousands of copies of this by New Year's."
Right.
And they pumped it out into the market. And as a result, by the end of January, when initially Capitol expected the song might be, you know, getting close to the top 40 and its climb to the top, it was number one.
Yeah.
So the Beatles had their number one hit song when they appeared on Ed Sullivan the next week.
Yeah. It's just kind of amazing that the synchronicity of it all,
Yeah,
but it
didn't plan for it.
is,
It just happened.
yeah. And it's fun to listen to Paul's story, but yeah, you have to listen to all the background behind it, and then those other labels, of course, VJ and Swan, their records previously doing nothing, zoomed to the top too. So,
BJ definitely profited from that because
yeah.
they were in severe financial straits. So much so that their biggest act, the Four Seasons, had left the label because they hadn't been receiving their royalties.
Right.
Well, now VJ had this album's worth of Beatles songs, which they proceeded to release in multiple different packaging throughout the year,
Hmm.
um, and they were selling millions of copies of it.
Hmm.
Even something as head scratching as Jolly What, England's biggest hitmakers, the Beatles and Frank Ifield, who's a yodeler.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah.
there are only a couple of Beatles songs, and the rest were Frank Ifield. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of fans felt gypped when they got that album.
Yeah.
Um, but Capitol, of course, promptly sued VJ. They said, "You
Yeah.
lost your contract last year. You can't put this out." VJ said, "Stop us."
Yeah.
And eventually the courts said, "VJ, you stop."
Yeah. I think it's funny that VJ had the balls at least, or just the cleverness, to be more polite, to uh, put out basically the same album in at least three or four different incarnations. You know, is the Beatles versus the Four Seasons, and they paired it up
Wow.
with Four Seasons Greatest Hits, and songs, pictures, stories of the Beatles, and I forgot the other couple. You know, and of course, introducing the Beatles is what the original one was, and then they, you know, it's weird that they managed to get anything out because they're in so much trouble with Capital. They had to pull off "Love Me Do" and "P.S. I Love You" and replace it, and weird things like that. And it's like,
Well, they actually at one point created a new subsidiary label called Tolly.
oh yeah,
The Beatles songs on there, apparently thinking they could fool Capitol. They're like, oh, that's not VJ, that's another label entirely.
well, I'm sure, you know, it's like Capital wasn't, Capital would have gone over everybody because I mean, I think they went after Swan too for "She Loves You," and then Swan says, well, they don't have the rights to the German version. Let's put that one out. You know,
Yes,
didn't do
which
anything,
eventually
but
Capitol seized. They took
yeah.
that as well. Uh,
So
there
they
was
tried. Very
there was such
clever.
a flood of anything Beatles related, Beatles adjacent, anything that could claim to be somehow connected with the Beatles, all found its way onto vinyl in the United States.
Yeah,
The stuff they did in 61 and 62 in Germany with Tony Sheridan, My Bonnie,
yeah.
um, that got released by MGM, who of course marketed it as My Bonnie by the Beatles.
Oh yeah, big letters.
And it was a hit. It was
Yeah.
the top 40 hit.
Hmm.
Um, the Ain't She Sweet song the Beatles had recorded, just kind of as a knockoff at that time, it was a top 10 hit in the US.
Yep.
Um, and some people who later became big stars. There was a song by a young Bonnie Jo Mason, which was the stage name of Cher,
Yeah.
who put out a song that was, I think it was I Love You Ringo.
Yeah.
And there was an obscure group called the Photo 54, which was actually Harry Nilsson.
Hmm.
Um, and those songs didn't go anywhere, but nevertheless, it shows you the demand, insatiable demand
Oh yeah.
in those early years of the early months of the British invasion for all things Beatles.
Yeah. Well, you know, as we were talking earlier about the Hard Day's Night soundtrack, they even put those George Martin instrumentals out as singles too. And the singles, most people don't care about them, but they like the picture sleeves because, of course, they put pictures of the Beatles on the
Yes.
singles. So, you know,
Well, let me
eh,
think. The end of the summer of '64, you had A Hard Day's Night as number 1 album.
mhm,
Something New was the number 2 album.
mhm,
Also in the top 10 were Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album.
mhm,
And filling out the rest of the top 40 was Introducing the Beatles. And then Beatle adjacent albums like Hear the Beatles Tell All, which was
yeah,
actually just audio interviews they had done, no
right.
music. There was the Hollywood Strings, which was
Oh yeah.
a instrumental group doing the Beatles hits.
Hmm.
And then my personal favorite, the Chipmunks sing the Beatles
Oh
hits.
yeah.
Those were all top 40 albums at the same time.
Hmm.
And the demand for all things Beatles was just incredible.
Yeah. Now, I do have a couple stories in those. I'll say the Chipmunks one. So, Ross Bagdasarian actually did meet with Brian Epstein at least. I don't know if he met with the Beatles himself to get permission to do that. So he didn't just throw out a knockoff album. He actually sought permission to do it.
Yes.
And then it's the first Chipmunks album that he didn't sing the songs. He had this other group, which I forgot the name. It's in my book. I did Chipmunks book. That's how I know this. That did they sang the theme song for the second and third season on Gilligan's Island, so they had the harmonies and everything. They did the Chipmunks vocals on that album because Ross didn't have the pipes to do all those harmonies and high voices. He smoked too much and stuff like
Amazing
that.
to
So
know.
yeah, so that's that album. Then the other one was what was the one you just said?
Hollywood Strings.
Hollywood Strings. I just found this out and I didn't even know this. Stu Phillips was interviewed by Charles Rosenay recently. I got him the interview because I did a Monkeys book and interviewed Stu Phillips, who did the incidental music on the Monkeys. He also did those Holly Ridge Strings albums. He
Really?
arranged them and conducted them and everything like that. He revealed on this recent interview, he's like 93 now. He said the label he was on was like, what are you doing those Hollywood Strings albums for Capitol? You're supposed to be working here, you know. And he was working for Colpix and Colgems, and those RCA released albums. And then he said, "Get back over here." And then they did eventually do a Monkees instrumental album they took control of. But it's funny because yeah, those Hollywood Strings albums did really well. They even put a snippet of it on the Beatles story. So
Yeah, yeah.
so
Well, there was money to be made, and money was made.
yeah. So, any other little highlights or tidbits before we kind of wrap up and everything like that should be entice
Yeah.
people to buy your book?
Well, one of the things I discussed is how recording artists were kind of shafted, well, to this day, kind of shafted by their record labels. The
Mhm.
Beatles sold 25 million records in the United States in 1964. But to put that into better perspective, they earned a half cent a record. And on every half cent, Brian Epstein, their manager, took 25%. The remainder of that, they had to split four ways. So even though these millions of records being sold, the Beatles were not getting rich from record sales.
Farthings.
John and Paul were making pretty good bank from writing their songs, and they owned the rights to their songs, so they were doing okay with that. But really, the only money that musicians were making was from live performances. And the mentality for records for the longest time, really until the 60s, was that you did records to promote your touring. You want to have hits on the radio so people will come buy tickets to your live show.
Mhm.
That started to change in the 60s when people realized, or musicians were like, no, this is my art, and I
Yeah.
want the music and the vinyl to be important. So the Beatles had to tour. Um, they did tour in the summer of 64 in the United States. They charged $50,000 a performance. So they were making pretty good money off of that.
Mhm.
Um, but this introduces somebody who I've never seen mentioned in anything else. And I tried so hard to find her since. She's fallen off the face of the earth. But my biggest hero of the British invasion is a woman named Cappy Ditson.
Hmm. Never heard of her.
Cappy Ditson was an agent at the Red Carpet Travel Service of New York City.
Mhm.
Usually booked American families on cruises and excursions to Europe. And hey, you want to go down to Disneyland in California? We could book that for you. She gets a call 2 weeks before the Beatles tour is supposed to start, saying, "We don't know how to put this tour together. Unlike every other artist before who would play big theaters, so we're playing baseball stadiums. We don't know how to make this happen." Cappy said, "I'm on it."
Hmm.
Weeks later, when the tour started, Cappy had everything worked out. Every plane ticket, all the transportation, made sure the Beatles, their entourage, their amps, their instruments, their luggage, made it from the airport to the hotel to the stadium, then back to the next city. Um, there were no hitches whatsoever. She had it all planned out to a T. And the plan she worked up is essentially the plan every major artist uses to this day,
Hmm.
the Ditson plan. And she has completely disappeared in the mists of time. I don't think she
Wow.
has any idea of her importance to rock and roll. I think she should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Based on
She's
that, yeah.
profoundly changed how we see artists live in concert.
Interesting. I'll have to do a little research, see if I can dig something up.
Please do.
Uh, uh, you didn't find anything in newspapers, or you did, and it was
I
just little blurbs, or
scoured I scoured newspapers.com,
Mhm. Mhm.
archive.org, everything I could find. Old phone books,
Hmm.
the Social Security Register. Can't find. Now I'm assuming Cappy is a nickname, which is
Mhm.
why it's so difficult finding where she went to.
Right.
Uh, but the only thing I learned about her was she gave one interview, I think might have been Billboard
Mhm.
in 1964, discussing what she did and all the details of putting the tour together. It's the only reason I know about Cappy.
Wow. Wonder if Billboard would know, but it's like so long ago they probably don't. I
I
don't know.
reached out to Billboard to try and get some other information, and they essentially said, "Yeah, whatever we have, we put it online. Nobody here keeps track of that stuff anymore."
Yeah. Oh well. Get Bruce Spicer or Mark Lewison on the beat. I don't
That's
know.
that's Well, yeah,
Yeah,
Bruce maybe he could maybe track that down personally. I don't know.
yeah,
Mark was British, right? I don't know if he wants to
yeah.
promote
He's on the
that.
British side. He doesn't care about the invasion. Yeah, it's like, I don't know if that's true, but anyway. All right. Well, that it was a pleasure having you on the show. Let's do just like one more quick plug. Hold up the book. Mention how people can get in contact with you if they want to ask you questions, or if you have any websites or anything else you want to promote.
Well, I'm on Facebook under Gene Popa, author.
Okay.
This is the book right here, British Invasion, available from Bear Manor Media as in hardcover, paperback, and as an e-reader. I should say there were also plans to put out an audiobook, and it would have been done now, but my narrator is in a guild that is sympathizing with the SAG-AFTRA strike, so they are not working, and I fully support the strike. So I told them, it doesn't matter, we can do it whenever you're ready to go.
Okay.
So at some point there will be an audiobook.
That'll be a bonus later on.
Yes. Yeah, the book, ample photos in here. Photos that, for the most part, I've not seen anywhere else. I mostly use newspaper clippings and advertisements and things that generally don't get used in
Yeah.
books. So I went
Yeah.
with something different there.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that. I didn't. I'm sorry, but yeah, I thought that was a nice touch because, and you didn't just put Beatles ads. There's ads for Cilla Black and
Oh,
all the other artists and everything that came through. You
well,
know.
one of my favorites was there's an ad that VJ put out
Oh yeah, you can talk about that
where
if
they
you
were
want.
bragging about how, we're now the seventh biggest record company in America thanks to the Beatles. And I bet that's driving the big guys wild. And of course, you see a drawing of a pair of hands tearing a Capitol Records order sheet in half.
Yeah,
And that was them just poking the bear.
yeah, but
They were like,
also
"Oh, you're gonna sue us
they
now."
misspelled capital to capital, which is money. So I thought that was a
Yes.
very clever touch.
Thank you for reading Capitol Records.
So much cleverness for over those people over at BJ. It's like they certainly knew how to kind of wrangle little deals and side things and everything like that to get the
Well, they
job
were
done.
clever
So
enough to actually have their record company be profitable.
yeah.
Yeah, beyond the Beatles. How do you not make money selling Four Seasons records?
Right. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head for the last statement about the Four Seasons is that they were getting paid, so they're going to leave. So, it's like, because had they stayed, they had a number of hits on Phillips and the other labels later. So it's like, you know,
But it didn't stop
yeah.
VJ continuing to put out Four Seasons records, still having top 40 hits with them.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we got the stuff. Let's use it.
Yeah. But all record labels tended to do that. It's like if somebody had a hit and they had something in the archives, like Aretha Franklin is an example. When she had hits with Atlantic, Columbia went, "Oh, we have a bunch of records here. Let's put those out."
I
Anyway,
think an instance where it really worked out well would be when the Hollies left EMI in the early
oh yeah,
'70s. I forget who they went with. May have been Mercury. Uh, when they were putting out their next album on their new label, EMI decided to try and undercut them by putting out a previously recorded song by the Hollies, and that song happened to be "Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress," which
hmm.
hadn't done anything previously. Well, now it was a huge hit, and it's one of the best known songs by the Hollies. So I
Yeah.
don't think the Hollies were too upset that EMI did
As long as they get paid for it,
that.
if they, I'm sure, like we mentioned the Beatles ones, those Tony Sheridan ones. I don't know if they saw much money from those, so they're probably like,
I'm sure they saw nothing because there was
yeah,
only one original song in that batch, and that was "Cry for a Shadow," an
yeah,
instrumental by George,
yeah,
which was finally packaged as part of the anthology. But yeah,
right,
other than that, I think even if they got paid at the time, which I doubt, I think they just did it as a favor.
yeah,
They didn't get anything later
yeah.
on.
It might have been a session fee at best. So I don't even know the
And I'm
story on
doubting even that.
that. One last question. Any other books in the planning
Yes, I'm currently
that you could
writing
talk about?
a book about the Beatles.
Okay.
Um, it is going to focus on a span of their career that doesn't always get a lot of focus. It tends to get glossed over just because where it falls, and
Mhm.
that is from the end of touring in August of '66 to the release of Sergeant Pepper. Now, the recording of Pepper gets a lot of coverage, but those months leading up to it kind of get glossed over in a lot of biographies of the band, and it's really a fascinating period. They left touring and went into this period almost entirely convinced among themselves that the Beatles were done,
Right.
because they're like, all right, we're not going to tour anymore, but touring is what a band does. What are we if we don't tour?
Right.
And so they kind of all went their own separate ways for a few months and did individual things, and then came together and said, what do you think, lads? You want to see what we can do? And they hunkered down and gave us Sergeant Pepper and Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. So they did all right for themselves, but most books tend to be all about the summer of '66, the Nightmare tour and the release of Revolver.
Right.
Then you jump to Pepper, and that entire 9 month period in between gets a paragraph or two.
That sounds interesting. Yeah, looking forward to it. So, all right. Well, I want to thank you, Gene Popa, for being my special guest.
Thank you for
And
having
when the next Beatles book is ready, come on back, or you
me.
can come on back anyway. I probably, we could just chat about the Beatles or anything you want to talk about.
I'm always up
Uh,
for
and I thank you very much again. And this has been another Fun Ideas podcast, and we will see you next time.